We're here to talk about what I think is one of the most interesting applications of Web3 and tokens, which is a thesis I like to call proof of physical work. You all may have heard of proof of work before with Bitcoin mining. And the idea behind proof of physical work is what is other work that people can do, get paid in tokens, and create something of real value. And I'm pleased to be joined by three of the most interesting proof of physical work projects out there. So I'll turn it over to you and we can go down and maybe you all can introduce yourselves and tell the audience a little bit about what your project does.
Okay, should I start?
Yes.
Hi, Claudio Parrinello, CEO and co-founder of PlanetWatch. What is PlanetWatch doing? In a sentence, we are decentralizing and incentivizing environmental monitoring. I claim, I'm going to be very blunt, that Web3, a number of all the projects represented here by Web3 are the best chance to save the world. And we need Web3 to save the world. Why? Because we need a decentralized and transparent way to monitor essential resources, such as breathable air and drinkable water. We need to do this in a transparent way. We need people to get engaged to protect their own health. And we need technologies which enable transparent access to this information and collection of critical data such as air quality values. So it's about Web3, it's about, as far as we are concerned, it's about public health, and it's about raising awareness across the world of the importance of these issues and getting everybody engaged.
My name is Mark Phillips. I run business development for a company called Nova Labs, which is the founding member of the Helium Network. The Helium Network at this point is the largest decentralized wireless network in the world. So there's coverage in over 180 countries, 75,000 cities. There's about 950,000 physical nodes on the network that provide wireless coverage. Today, most of that coverage is for what are called IoT devices. You've got two devices here that use the network on the panel with me today. And we're now getting into deploying 4G and 5G wireless coverage using the same incentive mechanism. We've built, in a short period of time, just about 3 years, a community of people that didn't know anything about blockchains and didn't know anything about wireless, and we've turned them into this sort of rabid, very efficient coverage deploying mechanism. And it's all based on the economic incentive, which is the token known as HNT.
Ariel, Seidman, CEO and co-founder of Hivemapper. So we're building a decentralized global map. And so a map that one day will hopefully compete with the likes of Google Maps. And so the basic idea is that people buy a dash cam, deploy that dash cam into their car, and just do what they normally do, is drive, right? So it's really great for Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, FedEx drivers, people who are actually driving 30, 40, 50 hours a week. All of that imagery from the dash cam ultimately makes it up into Hivemapper, in which case there's kind of a whole pipeline of processing. We then take all of that processing, or the output of that processing, and turn it into mapping APIs that are then sold to businesses, whether it be logistics companies, state and local governments, commercial real estate, residential real estate companies. And then they go and integrate all of that mapping data within their own applications. And so they actually buy that from Hivemapper. So the key thing to remember in terms of mapping is that traditionally it's been very, very, very expensive, right? So if you look at Google, they have a good mapping pipeline, but it's a very, very expensive mapping pipeline. And so that limitation basically means that there are certain parts of the world that are just not economically viable, even for the likes of Google Maps to go and map and do so at a frequent enough basis, right? So if you go, let's say, downtown Palo Alto, University Avenue, which is Google's backyard, that main drag Google Street View sees probably once every 12 to 14 months. You go to suburban, let's say, Austin, Texas, maybe every 2 to 3 years, right? You go to Lagos, Nigeria, if Google actually has coverage from a Street View perspective, every 4 to 5 years, right? And so that gives you a sense of now with Hivemapper, just from a cost perspective, we can reach many, many, many more parts of the world, and we can do so more frequently. So that's a little bit about us.
Awesome, thank you all. So as is typical in bear markets, we get a lot of skepticism of why do you need tokens? Why Web3? So I wanted to ask you these questions because I've heard people ask, like, why can't you do this in a Web 2 kind of way? Why can't you do this without tokens? So maybe we can go in reverse order this time.
Sure. So we actually started Hivemapper with cash. So we broke the world up into these little tiles, and we paid people, like a cent for every single tile. The tiles are really, really small, to be clear. So basically a cent for every tile you mapped, right? And cash has a couple of really bad negative effects. One is that relationship between Hivemapper and the contributor just got crazy adversarial, right? If I was a contributor, I'd be like, you guys are cheating me, like blah, blah. So with blockchain, you can actually make it open and transparent in terms of how we actually came to the conclusion that you earn, let's say, 20 tokens for this drive. And you can basically see that entire process. And so you can never basically say, okay, Hivemapper's cheating me, because you can just go in and inspect the code yourself. The other big thing was our financial incentives are not aligned, right? So if we figure out how to scale this network, then Google can come along and pay, quite frankly, like 5 cents. They just have a bigger balance sheet than we do. And so by aligning our incentives between the contributor and Hivemapper with the token, we're all on the same team, right? We're all rowing and trying to build a map that is of high quality, of high coverage, of high freshness, right? Because ultimately we want customers using that, and the contributors are very aligned against that same objective. And then the last thing is that, look, ownership matters, right? Like that really, really matters in terms of the psychological effect of how these contributors think and the passion that they exert against these projects, because they're now partial owners in that, versus in the early days, Uber, the early Uber drivers, quite frankly, they provided tremendous value to that network. All of those Uber employees and Uber investors, they made out really well, but those drivers, they're probably still driving, quite frankly. I don't think that's right. If you look at Waze, which started like 2006, 2007 timeframe. So there's two parts of Waze, right? There's a part that we use, right, as like drivers just driving around, and we're obviously contributing to that map. But there's another part where there's like 20 or 30,000 Waze map editors, right? And these Waze map editors are sitting at a computer editing a map, right? Very, very tedious type of work. So when Google acquired Waze, it was like 1.2 billion or something like that, right? All the investors made, good bank. They should, no doubt about that. All the employees made good bank, they should. But those 20 or 30,000 people who spent, in many cases, hours every single week laboriously editing and creating this map made nothing. And so I look at that and say, look, like these people got shafted, right? Like without all that data coming from people like me driving and all these map editors, there's not a map, there's no data. And so I think that's the last part that token actually fixes, is like, hey, look, if this thing is actually big and important, then all these people who contributed the data, they should rightfully get a piece of the action as well.
Yeah, so I'll echo a lot of the things that Ariel said about why Hivemapper went with a token. Did you say the name of the token?
Oh, but it's the honey token.
Honey token. Nova Labs, which used to be called Helium Systems Incorporated, has actually been around for a lot longer than the sort of tenure of the Helium blockchain and the network. So we were founded about 9 years ago, and we had a traditional business selling public-private IoT networks to enterprises that wanted to monitor things like refrigerators and cold chain and track assets that were part of their business. And we fundamentally could not get over the hurdle of giving them enough wireless network coverage to make their use cases successful. And you guys probably see this every day, as do you, Claudio. And so we went back to the drawing board and said, how do we actually get people involved in participating in this network? And if anyone here has been involved in telco and wireless, the way that networks get built is very capital intensive and very antiquated. And so we looked at a model where we could basically convince people to participate and put capital and resources and motivation and sweat into building out this network. And so the token, HNT, gave us the ability to basically build this community of people that were entirely decentralized and were taking part and had ownership in this new model of building the network. And it worked out, quite frankly, better than anybody ever possibly could have imagined. One of the most interesting effects that we see now is, the token is very useful for building up supply very early, right? So in our network, supply is coverage, and then demand are companies like Hivemapper and PlanetWatch actually using the coverage. And so originally, early days, it was just people building coverage. They would buy something called a Helium hotspot. They would deploy it in their home, on roofs, on towers, and they would optimize the hell out of these deployments, which was fascinating to watch. And then over time, we would start to see people use the network once the supply was big enough where someone could put a Hivemapper camera, a PlanetWatch sensor on it. Where we're getting to now is a really fascinating point where people who are building out the network coverage are core users from day one. So they satisfy their use case, which is to deploy a sensor, and then they add public network coverage and they earn the incentive directly from the blockchain. And so that's been super powerful for us.
Yeah, in my case, I would say we are tackling a huge challenge, and the Web3 seems to be it's a no-brainer. It's the only winning approach to that. So what's the challenge? Where in New York City, let's make a local example. I used to study at NYU a long time ago. So you are an NYU guy, you are in Washington Square, have decent ventilation, little traffic, you put an air quality sensor in the square, air quality is very good, typically good. You walk 2 blocks away, you get on Broadway, tall buildings, kind of narrow street, heavy traffic, you can have a very dangerous localized pollution hotspot. What's the problem? The problem is that unless you have a sensor right there where pollution is, you're not going to detect timely and mitigate the hotspot. You're not just going to see it. So if you want to manage air quality correctly in a city, identify pollution hotspots, study them, study what triggers them, and better protect public health, you need a very dense network of air quality sensors almost every block in every city, which looks impossible. It looks like a huge challenge in terms of cost, in terms of time of deployment, in terms of approach. So where Web3 comes in is that we figure out that the best way to get sensors at every corner in every city in the world is to engage with local residents. So to incentivize ordinary people, local residents, to deploy and operate and approve their quality sensor and gather data which will go automatically to PlanetWatch. AI then extracts value out of it. So to us, Web3 was essentially the only approach to solving this challenge of deploying dense network sensors essentially on demand, anywhere, seamlessly and in a cost-effective way. So now, why a token to do that? Because, of course, we're talking about incentivizing people. So a token, a utility token related to data streams. So we essentially pay with utility tokens each valid data stream sent to us. Then we gather all these data streams, we analyze the flows, and ultimately we extract value out of the data. So people get paid, quote unquote, for sending data to us. That's step one, is kind of a down payment. And ultimately, when aggregated data get monetized and sold, they will get a cut from this, the proceeds of the sales in tokens based on their actual contribution. So to us, Web3 was just the only way to tackle this challenge. And I think it's very exciting and wonderful to realize that, the three people sitting on this desk, the Web3, the synergy between our projects is absolutely obvious because, to stream data to our platform, we need connectivity. We need connectivity all over the place, and that could come from Helium. And in fact, Hivemapper could help us gather data in a very effective way by deploying sensors on the cars which are taking data for Hivemapper. And again, it's ironical that there was an air quality company a few years ago trying to do something similar to what we do, partnering with Google Cars, which was very cool, of course, and attractive to investors, but not scalable enough, which is exactly what we are hearing here. The only way to be pervasive, to go everywhere fast and seamlessly, is to partner with people who must then have a stake in the success of the project, not only financially, but also in terms of engagement and owning the network and owning the issue.
So we've talked a lot about using tokens to incentivize people, but at the end of the day, I can't pay my bills with tokens. I can't eat tokens, right? So I'll throw this to you, Mark, to take this first. What makes the token valuable? Why does it have value?
Yeah, it's a great question. It'd be funny to try and eat tokens, though, wouldn't it? So a bit on the architecture of the token and sort of how the Helium network works. So it's a layer 1 blockchain called the Helium blockchain. There's a base layer utility token called HNT. And HNT is produced by providing coverage and being a participant in the network with a piece of hardware that provides physical wireless coverage for a device. Today it's primarily IoT devices, and starting very soon, or already started, is 4G and 5G cellular devices. And so you provide coverage, you mine a token, you produce HNT. Now, the design of the token is based on something called the burn and mint equilibrium. The shortest way to think about it is HNT is burned into something called data credits, and then data credits are used to actually pay the transaction fees on the network. So the way that the token attains value is basically based on the usage of the network itself, right? So when you want to, actually we were just talking about this backstage, if you're sending a packet from a Hivemapper, just call it the mapper, the cam, the dash cam?
Hivemapper dash cam.
Hivemapper dash cam. You, in this case Hivemapper, pays the Helium blockchain a very, very, very small percentage of an HNT, some amount of data credits. And then when that happens, in order to use the blockchain, you take HNT out of circulation, you burn it, you spend data credits, and they disappear. So it's a natural sort of deflationary mechanism. And so we're still early days in the Helium network. We've been building this for 3.5 years. From a usage perspective on the IoT side, there is a tremendous amount of usage, right? We're doing hundreds of millions of packets from devices across the network every month. And as the usage starts to grow on the IoT side and on the cellular and 5G side, we should see added demand on the token, again, taking HNT out of circulation, burning it to data credits, and then using that for transaction fees. So that's the basis of our model.
Got it. And do either of you want to add anything if your model differs?
Yeah, model's very, very similar to Helium. Obviously, we read the white paper and found it interesting.
Nice. It's a good one. Short.
Is the short version. But yeah, so from that perspective, it's quite similar. Obviously, the customers are very different in our world, right? The customers for us are logistic customers, state and local government, commercial real estate. These are existing buyers of B2B. So to put into context, Google Maps API has 4.5 to 5.5 million developers. The vast majority of those are paid just because the free tier is so low that you can't really do anything useful with it, quite frankly. And so even if you never open up the Google Maps application on your iPhone or Android device, you're still probably interacting with Google Maps data multiple times throughout your day, right? You go to Uber, you go to Lyft, you go to Airbnb, you go to Zillow, all these different places. You fill out an insurance application, all that stuff on the back end is hitting Google Maps APIs, and it gets quite expensive. So that's really like the low-hanging fruit that exists, and customers are looking for alternatives. A, because Google Maps is very pricey, and B, because of the issues we talked about in terms of freshness and coverage. There's another aspect of it, which is, look, I think if you go into this world of building out physical infrastructure and you're requiring the contributor to spend a lot of brain cycles on your product every single day, they're not gonna do it, right? Because of what you said, right? Like, I can't pay myself and I can't buy, breakfast, lunch, and dinner with tokens. And so it has to be passive, right? The contribution mode or the default contribution mode has to be extraordinarily passive. In our case, it's driving. People come up to me like, oh, I'm gonna get a Hivemapper dash cam, I'm gonna go out there, I'm gonna drive, but oh my God, gas prices are really high, so I don't know. I was like, don't go out and drive for Hivemapper, right? Like if you're already driving, then great, this is an opportunity. And we've actually thought about the Hivemapper dash cam. Look, there's a lot of people who already buy dash cams, right? And so can that, like whatever the dash cam is, can that be the primary reason you're buying is because you just want a great dash cam for insurance purposes or safety purposes or otherwise, and Hivemapper is almost secondary, right? So whatever happens with the token price, that dash cam is providing you as the driver underlying utility.
Yeah, just a couple of months. I mean, when we devised what's called token model, we thought about we wanted the token, ultimately the token value to be very directly correlated to the value of data. That's the game. And we took two precautions. First of all, in our model, token release is directly correlated to the size of the network. So the number of tokens being released is directly correlated to number of sensors being activated. That's step one. And step two, we are a finite supply token model. So since eventually access to our data, API, wholesale access to our data will be payable in planets, and eventually that will be a very transparent process via smart contract. That would drive, that's a source of demand for planets, and that's what drives the value of the planet. So you want a token whose evolution and whose release and value is directly correlated to the actual funding value of the project. That's my take.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in that case, how do you think about pricing for your products, for all of you? In addition to pricing, how do you think about the cost structure? How much would it cost to build what you're building using Web 2 traditional type of technologies? And then how does that affect your pricing?
So first, can I offer, so I'm a customer of Helium, right? Like even if I didn't know these guys, I would still use it. So we're using it for location verification purposes, right? Because we know that people will try to spoof the location of their Hivemapper dashcam. If they do that, that obviously kills trust in the map and it kills the map itself, right? So we're using them for location verification. So Hivemapper Inc. is actually paying the data credit. So we were pricing it out, and I don't know, I'll share something that you may not want to share, is like, I was like, holy shit, this is really cheap. And then I looked at it, I was like, okay, maybe that's a feature, not a bug, because it's so cheap. But actually I looked at it again, I was like, no, this is too cheap.
Yeah.
So the pricing from a customer perspective is just crazy affordable.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, to nail down pricing. If you're like a standard, and this actually gets back to your original question, Tushar, about why a token versus like a centralized entity that might just be distributing, cash to people who are involved in the ecosystem. If you are a telco that's building a service to give people access to put an IoT device on the network, or you're like an established Internet of Things network service provider that has a commercial model around device connectivity, you set your own price points and you figure out what your margins are, and you do some sort of financial modeling, looking at your competitors, and you figure out how to actually do business there. When we started the Helium network, which, what are we in now, August, September? So that was so almost like exactly 37 months ago. We sat down and we did a bunch of modeling and said, okay, well, if the network gets this big and we have this many devices, and we assume that the cost of capital going into building the infrastructure across all the participants is X, and for, to earn HNT, you earn it through just providing raw coverage, and then also by routing packets from, Hivemappers and PlanetWatch sensors. What is a reasonable amount of money to charge someone for that? And we settled on something which is wildly cheap, right? It's every dollar worth of HNT that you burn into data credits purchases you 100,000 packets on the Helium network. To sort of put that into context, if you are sending a GPS lat long, or a location packet from a GPS every 5 minutes for an entire year, it costs you like just over $1 worth of data credits. Is the price correct? I don't know, right? But what's interesting is that the community can come together and say, this is too cheap, right? We spent too much money building out this infrastructure, and as a percentage of the HNT that we earn, there should be more money going into the ecosystem from the PlanetWatches and the Hivemappers of the world. And so we have a mechanism where people can come in and say, listen, I think the price should be X instead of Y. And you can propose it, and you can debate it, and you can vote it up or down. So I wouldn't be surprised if someone made a suggestion in the community that the price should go up. If that were to happen, I mean, they could say it should go down too, right? You guys could come in and argue that, hey, cut the price in half and I'd be much happier. And if that were to happen, it'd be a fun debate to have. But yeah, pricing is hard.
All of a sudden, I feel like I'm negotiating against myself.
Yeah, I mean, you're not paying me though, you're paying the blockchain, right? So I want you to get the cheapest access to the blockchain as possible.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I mean, I'll tell you what the pricing challenge is in our case. The beauty of Web3 is such that as PlanetWatch, we can even decentralize business development. What I mean by this? I mean that our core business is going to be to build big data sets and offer access in bulk, wholesale, you could say, via APIs. And the API's access will be decentralized itself because it will be managed by a smart contract as soon as this is feasible. So in a way, we are offering any corporate, any player in the world with sufficient skills to leverage our data, the possibility to buy data from our smart contract. So on one hand, there will be end user pricing, which will be extremely flexible, because there could be a local consulting firm in Melbourne managing to sell a dashboard with PlanetWatch data injection to the local government, some pricing. Other people will plug their PlanetWatch data in an app for leisure apps, and we are already getting lots of requests for that. What we need to, and there will be completely different pricing level at the level of their end user. What we need to decide upon is the price for wholesale access to our data set, and that is not easy because we believe we are creating a brand new product. So it will be an iterative process where we discuss with potential partners interested to leverage the data. We set some ballpark pricing. We see whether they manage to build their own margin to sell to end users, and we build it will be a kind of a price discovery process, which I think is interesting in itself. And eventually, in the Web3 logic, the community itself could make proposals to tweak this wholesale pricing based on market conditions and new opportunities. But pricing itself is a very interesting subject.
It's complex and nuanced. I want to go back to the cost side of the equation, right? The way that I think about proof of physical work as a thesis, and I think about these networks, is that we are using blockchain technology to enable people to coordinate with each other to create a capital asset. Create an asset that is worth something, whether that is a map, telecommunications network, air quality network, but you're creating an asset that's worth something. If you were to try to create this using a centralized Web 2 approach, like if you tried to build your own map, but you hired everyone instead of having open source contributors, or you hired all of the people to put up the Helium hotspots instead of having anyone do it, what do you think the cost difference is?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, in the maps world, there's obviously, we talked about the Google approach, right, which is very centralized, very, very expensive, their own cars. Every one of those Google Street View cars is anywhere between like $500,000 to $750,000 each. So like that massive sensor package, right, on top of it. And that doesn't count gas and paying the drivers and then security. Like if there are certain countries in the world, when they drive those Google Street View cars around, they need a security detail to follow that Google Street View car around, because otherwise it gets stolen, right? So from a map, so you can do that approach, right, the very expensive, or you can do the purely open source, OpenStreetMap type. The problem with that approach is that it just takes forever, right? OpenStreetMap didn't really get started in 2002, 2003, didn't really get to scale until about 2014, 2016 timeframe. So a long, long time just because it's all open source contributors. So in the mapping world, there's three basic cost components. One is collection, right? So all the hardware, the drivers, the airplanes going out and collecting, that is by far the biggest cost element. Number two is map processing and map QA. So that's, okay, how do I take this raw data and transform it into something valuable, and then make sure that I QA it properly. And then the third is map serving, right? Like ultimately serving the data to the customer. The cost advantages for Hivemapper is in collection and processing, right? So we talked a little bit about collection just being like, it's not our own cars, it's not our own dash cams, it's not our own equipment, it's not our own gas, right? We're not paying these people, so obviously that's very clear. Map processing, the big opportunity there for us is moving more and more of that map processing onto the dash cam itself. From a privacy perspective, it's really important that we do that, but more from a cost perspective, the more that you could take that off of an AWS server and put it at the edge, obviously that reduces your cost. So those are the two big opportunities of bringing down the cost structure. We're well on our way towards achieving that. Just to put into context, I was giving you guys an example of University Avenue in Palo Alto, which is Google's backyard, that main drag. For Google sees that, or Google Street View, I should say, sees that once every maybe 14 months. For that same cost, we can see that every single week, right? So just massive cost advantage from a freshness perspective versus what they have.
Yeah. So there's a relatively straightforward calculation you can make when you look at the Helium network and figure out just how much it would have cost to deploy in terms of raw hardware, right? So we've got, let's call it 1 million Helium hotspots that primarily do IoT connectivity. We can say the average price of that is maybe $500 US, because there's different models and they have different prices based on how they get deployed. So quick crazy numbers is we have $500 million worth of hardware, right, deployed. That is a lot of capital, quite frankly. And no one's ever spent that much money deploying an IoT network specifically using the protocol that we use. If you're T-Mobile or AT&T or Verizon, you spend that money all the time looking for sites to put 5G and 4G radios. But $500 million to deploy an IoT network is not likely something that would have happened had the Helium community not done it. And it's much more expensive than $500 million, right? Because you have to find the locations, you have to pay for backhaul, you have to pay for power. And so all these things are rolled into that number. And so 500 million is a lot easier to spread across 200,000 individuals, right, that are incentivized to be a part of it. I've actually never done that math before. It's kind of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, in my opinion, I mean, on top of the capital cost that we can kind of back on the envelope estimate for each of our projects, to me, the key difference between Web 2 and Web 3 is that Web 2, the time to market would diverge, would be infinite. What I mean is the following. In order to be relevant for these projects, you want to achieve fast global coverage. For PlanetWatch, you want to have a hyperlocal coverage, so lots of sensors in say, the hundreds largest cities in the world as fast as you can. Now, this thing is completely unachievable, if you ask me, in a Web 2 strategy within my lifetime, or even yours maybe. Because I mean, we did try to deploy in partnership with the local government directly, local utility companies. We didn't get anywhere. And on the other hand, we proved that this Web 3 community-based approach can go very, very fast. I mean, I like to say that 2 years ago, in Italy, we were under strict COVID lockdown conditions. So you couldn't move one finger, and especially you couldn't talk to the government, you couldn't talk to companies. So deploying a sensor in any traditional way would have been impossible. On the other hand, we wanted to deploy fast in a city. We contacted the local citizen association concerned about environment. They identified 20 families. We shipped parcels to 20 families by ordinary mail, open the box, plug and play, stream by the internet, goes live on the map. So to me, this is the real game changer and a real difference between Web 2 and Web 3, that if you engage ordinary people to collaborate in the project, you cut timescales by a factor of maybe 100. So cost is not even right. Of course, there is a cost aspect that community is ready to bear part of the hardware cost, which is important. But even if you had an infinite amount of money, with a Web 3 strategy, you will not achieve your goals in any reasonable amount of time. To me, that's the key thing.
And so on that same front, a lot of the cost here is in the hardware, right? There's a substantial capital investment into creating these hardware networks. How do you think about manufacturers? Like, who is actually making this hardware? And how do you have like a community or an ecosystem of manufacturers? And maybe I'll ask Mark you to hit this first, because Helium is the oldest of the 3 projects.
Oh, we're all crazy that we make hardware, just as a quick aside. So, the Helium network has grown so fast because Nova Labs, again, at that point called Helium Systems Inc., we made the first set of hotspots. I think it was like 10,000 or 12,000 Helium hotspots. If anybody here is familiar with the network, it's that the community calls them the OGs. It's the white square with the black circle. And we sold through all of those. And I remember having a conversation with our CEO and COO at the time about the PO, or the size of the order we had to place for the next chunk of hotspots, which was $5 or $10 million US for 20,000 units or something. And we debated it, and we said, maybe there's a better way to do this. If this thing is really going to grow, we need more parties in the ecosystem being involved, building a network, offsetting the risk that we have, and ultimately sharing in the growth of the ecosystem so that they could see an excuse to be a part of it. So we opened up the process with the community under something called HIP 19. HIPs are Helium Improvement Proposals. That's how the community makes decisions. And that put forth a suggested framework for verifying new hardware manufacturers. And when that happened and passed, the growth of the network exploded. We had 5, 10 companies come in very quickly, propose new designs. They got approved by what is now called the Helium Foundation. Today we have, I think, closer to 35 approved manufacturers. And that entire process sits inside of the Helium Foundation. It's entirely governed and managed by them. And anyone can come in and get a piece of hardware verified that they have to support and sell and manage on the network. That, I think, might be the single biggest thing we ever did for the success of the actual coverage. That was massive for us. Yeah.
So we definitely are inspired by a lot of things that Helium has done. We're taking a slightly different approach. The key reason is that with the Helium hotspot, you deploy it, you put it into an extra bedroom or someplace else. You don't really look at it, right? With a dash cam, you're going to get in that car, you're going to see that dash cam every single day. And so it's really important, just the aesthetics of it, the reliability of it. That's a big one. So we want to have a little bit more control over that. So we're building the first 2 Hivemapper dash cams before we go out and engage partners. There's already a lot of partners who want to build. So many of those that have come over from the Helium ecosystem now looking to build their own version of a Hivemapper dash cam, which is we'll fully support it. But we did feel like we're going to hold on to the hardware manufacturing and design a little bit longer than probably Helium did, just because of the way that people interact with our device is a little bit different.
Yeah, in our case, hardware is really critical, and I think the context is slightly different from their projects because, for Helium, hardware is a router, essentially. Mm-hmm. So, and it delivers connectivity, which is kind of a commodity. So as long as it works, let me say, it works. Simple as that. On the other hand, we are not betting on a commodity. We are betting on high-value data. And air quality is difficult to measure. You need the right hardware, the right components into the monitor. You need to calibrate, you need to verify, you need to test. So hardware is really a challenge for us because on one hand, we want to be frictionless and scalable, so we don't want to build hardware ourselves because otherwise we cannot grow fast. On the other hand, we know that we need to set the specs in a very specific way, and we want to test each and every type of hardware because we onboard it. And that's what we are doing. We are setting the specs, but we are checking that it works because the value of the data critically depends on the way the sensor is assembled, on the components, on the way it's calibrated, and of course also on the way it's deployed. So it's a very sensitive project, and we are looking for the best approach to keep it scalable, to keep it lean, while assuring quality of the data. And that is a challenge.
So, you all have mentioned some aspects of governance, whether it's related to pricing or approving manufacturers. How do you think about governance? And how do you think about token holders having governance? What should they be able to govern? And is governance important?
You want to take that one first, Mark?
Sure.
You guys deal with this right now.
Yeah. Oh man, governance is fascinating. So we think a lot about governance. I mentioned in the last response that we have something called a Helium Improvement Proposal, or a HIP. This is modeled on BIPs from Bitcoin and EIPs from the Ethereum community. One of the most fascinating and exciting things about the Helium community is that the community itself is wildly rabid and very, very active in how the network gets built, and this is what we wanted. And so, I guess I'm speaking for Nova Labs, not the entire Helium community or the foundation. We believe very deeply in governance. Right? We want people to have a say in how the network gets built. It's impossibly hard, right? You think about governance, Tushar, probably more than most people in the crypto space. I don't think any project, including Helium, has nailed it just yet. Today, for example, there was a vote that opened on the Helium community, or in the Helium community, to consider moving the blockchain itself off of Helium to a different layer 1 blockchain. Solana was the one that the core developers sort of suggested. Since we released that last week, it has expectedly been sort of wildly contentious. And this is quite frankly what we want, right? We want people who are HNT participants, whether they hold the token itself or they're part of the ecosystem, to have a say in how this goes. And so, yeah, I'll just say that I don't think, if anyone tells you that they've nailed governance, I don't think you should believe them, quite frankly. It is ever evolving and sort of needs to be taken care of as best it can. but it is extremely necessary, and you do well to pay attention to it as a project.
So without getting into like the super detailed weeds of like, how the governance mechanics and all that kind of stuff. So before I used to work at Yahoo Maps, that was really my first job out of school was Yahoo Maps. And so we used to sit there with this like massive spreadsheet and make these decisions for like, how much we were going to invest from a data perspective and data collection perspective and like this country in the world or that country in the world. And we're sitting in like Sunnyvale, California, making the decisions. Like I'd never been to like 80, 90% of these countries, and I'm making like, tens of millions of dollars of decisions on them, off of what I would consider fairly flimsy data. But like as the product, lead for these things, that's what my job was, or a big part of my job. And in retrospect, like that was a bad way of managing the map, right? Like a much better way is, look, there's people in Lagos, Nigeria, or South Korea, or Manila, who can make much better decisions about how frequently that map should be updated, right? What are the tools they're going to do? Maybe even like engaging potential customers in that area than I could ever do sitting in San Francisco, California. And so from a governance perspective, whatever we do, and that's kind of our thesis or our philosophy is like push these decisions down to the local level. Because also from a mapping perspective, there's like all these like local privacy issues that you have to like contend with, and they're different. A lot of them are cultural more than they are like even regulatory. And so we're not going to make the best decisions, and these decisions are best left in the hands of these local contributors and these local communities. And so if we set up this government structure that enables that, then I think we're just going to have a lot more success in a lot more parts of the world than if we try to make every decision or every other decision, in San Francisco.
Yeah, so let's face it, we started like a real standard Web 2 company with CEO making decisions and selling stuff, issuing invoices and refunds and all that. And we have a roadmap to become a full Web 3 company. And critical milestones in this roadmap relate to governance. So we are, I would say, halfway. So, and again, it encompasses many things. We don't want to sell stuff. We want smart contracts to grant access to stuff. This is one. In terms of governance, we started from a process where we ourselves make proposals to the community votes on them, so the community have a say, but they were not triggering proposals themselves. We are moving onto a process inspired by Helium and other projects where community grassroots proposals will emerge. There will be a structured process to assess the traction they get, and eventually they will get approved or not. So it is a roadmap. We are moving ahead. We submitted, I think, at least 2 or 3 proposals to the community in the last few weeks. So we are trying to get people engaged and get them to have a say in whatever we do, whatever move we do. But it is very difficult. It is to make it fully decentralized, fully transparent, and fully global. It's a process that takes time. Nobody has nailed it yet, but we're making progress. It's a goal. It's an endpoint where we want to get. And I think we'll get there, and we will leverage also other project experience to go fast and get it right.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So I wanted to ask each of you, what has been the biggest hurdle to getting people onboarded onto your networks? What has been the most difficult thing? What do people get confused by or not want to do? And whoever wants to go first.
The biggest issue we have is, we had 2 big issues. One is people misaligning the dash cam. Like you would think it's kind of simple, like just like you need like horizontally stable, but you always see like these pictures, they come back crooked, and like, come on. So that was always like an issue. And so there's actually now we embedded in the actual install process like this. Anyways, it helps you figure that out if there's an issue like that. So that was a big one. The second biggest one actually came afterwards, which is like places like Manila that got saturated. People would be like, hey, this person's not allowed to map in my region. And they would like yell at us, like to like tell that person to stop mapping. We're like, we can't do that, dude.
Yeah, for us, I will say from an IoT network coverage perspective and the supply side, we've sort of gotten past most of the initial problems. That flywheel on the coverage is running, continues to run. And when we did have a problem, it was a good problem to have. It was basically hardware shortages, right? The community wanted to expand the network and participate in the incentive, but our manufacturers, through all sorts of supply chain issues and things like that, could not. That was the biggest hurdle for us. Hopefully, we won't hit that again with 5G. We'll see what happens there.
Yeah, same for us. I mean, we faced last year a huge traction in the community and the hardware global supply crisis. So we built waiting lists of people waiting for hardware, which was maybe not a great idea because people get fed up at some point and unhappy. And we also were possibly not careful enough in selecting some hardware suppliers because you need to have a very strong trust relationship with whoever you partner with in this ecosystem. So we learned a few hard lessons, and I'm very confident that we learned what we had to learn. Now the hardware situation, at least in our ecosystem, is much better than before, and we think we'll be able to onboard all the people who want to come on board fairly fast in the coming weeks and months. So I think the worst is over, hopefully, on that side.
All right, I know I said that was the last one, but just if anyone in the audience wants to learn more about your projects, or anyone watching the recording wants to learn more about your projects, where should they go? What should they follow?
Hivemapper.com, or you could follow us on Twitter. We're pretty active there, just on Hivemapper.
Yep, helium.com, twitter.com/helium. If you have any HNT and you want to vote, go to heliumvote.com. There's a vote open for HIP70, extremely important.
So planetwatch.io, and in particular the blog section on our website, we issue lots of blog posts, very detailed ones, and hopefully very informative ones.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here.
Thank
we
you,
really
Tushar.
appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.